But it's a welcome respite, and we're grateful for you attending and an opportunity to meet old friends and colleagues and also clients. I don't think this event could be more timely. The South African public's frustration with corruption and the lack of enforcement is widely recognized, and the concomitant clarion call could not be clearer or louder from the public. The amount of malfeasance and corruption which has emerged from the close on 27 months of testimony during the Zondo Commission of Inquiry cannot be understated. Certain sources claim that the state capture debacle has cumulatively resulted in a 1.5 trillion rand loss. As a practice, Primero has been intimately involved before the Zondo Commission. It's been a mammoth exercise. More troubling, though, is the anticipated workload which will fall on the shoulders of our National Prosecuting Authority. It's acknowledged that the NPA has not prosecuted a major complex corruption case for over 10 years. Concerns range from experience in investigating cases of complex cross-border corruption to a lack of capacity. Recently, the NPA commented that it will be unable to prosecute individuals named in Justice Zondo state capture reports. Regardless of capacity and skill challenges, it is trite that litigating complex cases of corruption and bribery is a colossal task. Many non-complex cases take years to conclude. And even if our agencies were sufficiently equipped to prosecute all that has emerged from the 3 Zondo reports which have been released, doing so successfully and in a costly and timely manner is questionable. South Africa urgently needs to consider alternative means to address the avalanche of corruption cases. Recent initiatives from the private sector should be lauded. These include commitments from Business Unity South Africa to assist the prosecutorial services in addressing this malaise with experienced counsel from the private bar. The sheer amount of losses through state capture and the finite ability of the prosecuting agencies requires more to be done. While many like to believe the contrary, South Africa's challenges are not unique. Again, the timing of this evening's panel cannot be emphasized enough. Recent policy work done by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in drafting a number of recommendations aimed at combating corrupt activities provide the perfect platform for local use. Accordingly, international best practice tools to assist exist. The OECD recommendations form part of a strategic initiative to assist governments worldwide in implementing anti-corruption policies proven through experience to work. Although not a member state, the recommendations are binding on South Africa, and as will be discussed during this evening's panel, could play a huge role in creating an expedited process for the resolution of cases of corruption and bribery. Such initiatives can only be welcomed. The International Bar Association has been instrumental in ensuring the best manner in which to implement the provisions of the recommendations internationally. South Africa is no exception, and my fellow partner Michael James's efforts in pursuing implementation locally are meritworthy. As a panel will discuss, the recommendations cater for a variety of means to expedite the resolution of cases of corruption. Primero recently hosted an event in conjunction with the Mail and Guardian newspaper, during which the role of whistleblowers and the need for their recognition was discussed by local and international panelists. I know our panelists this evening will discuss this topic and its importance. Equally, a large portion of this event will traverse the use of non-trial resolutions to resolve anti-corruption cases. These are likened to settlement agreements entered into by a prosecuting authority and an alleged offender without the use of a full court or administrative proceeding. We have, as Primero, witnessed firsthand the efficacy of similar proceedings in the form of consent orders before the South African competition agencies. It is therefore of importance that our prosecuting agency has expressed its intent on implementing a policy for use of non-trial resolutions in South Africa. This will have a positive impact on ensuring successful and timely resolution of corruption and foreign bribery cases. Accordingly, it's essential that the discussion and debate surrounding these important issues are not concluded in a vacuum, but that the society at large remains intimately involved. Input from all sectors, private, judicial, the executive, and the general public is necessary to create a more efficient and expedient resolution of cases, saving state court resources and taxpayers' money, while also achieving some form of restorative justice, which goes beyond mere administrative sanction to include compliance with a set of rehabilitative governance policies is essential. While our expert panel requires little introduction, I'm happy to say we have ensured comprehensive representation across all necessary spheres in ensuring that solutions to the malaise can be found. Before we kick off with the panel, I'd like to provide our audience with some insight into each. The Honourable Minister of Justice and Correctional Services of South Africa, Ronald Lamola, Justice Dennis Davis, Judge of the High Court and the President of the Competition Appeal Court. Justice Davis is a member of the Commission of Inquiry into Tax Structure of South Africa and was previously a technical advisor to the Constitutional Assembly. Judge Davis is active in debates on corruption and state capture. Advocate Willie Hofmeyer, previously the Deputy National Director of Public Prosecutions in South Africa and the former head of the Asset Forfeiture Unit at the National Prosecuting Authority. Mr. Hofmeyer is an expert on asset forfeiture and recovery and anti-corruption strategies. Ms. Shopia Williams-Elegbe is a professor and head of Department of Mercantile Law and the Deputy Director of the African Procurement Law Unit at Stellenbosch University, specializing in public procurement law, anti-corruption law, sustainable development law, and commercial law. Mr. John Dlulu is a board member of BUSA and the current Chief Executive Officer of the Small Business Institute with extensive experience in strategic risk and reputation management. Drago Kos is the chair of the OECD Working Group on Bribery in International Business Transactions and a member of the International Anti-Corruption Advisory Board, who played an active role in drafting of the OECD anti-bribery recommendations. Mr. Peter Solmsen is a US lawyer and business executive who previously served as General Counsel of Siemens AG. He was involved in the negotiations of the first internationally coordinated settlement of multiple foreign bribery prosecutions and led a global campaign against bribery. He is also a member of the International Bar Association's Anti-Corruption Committee and chairs the subcommittee on non-trial resolutions. Ms. Jennifer Arlen has served as the president of both the American Law and Economics Association and the Society for Empirical Legal Studies. She is a law professor at New York University, an economist, and one of the leading scholars in the world of bribery and corruption. Currently, Jennifer is associate reporter for the enforcement of the American Law Institute's Principles of Compliance and Enforcement of Organizations. My partner, Mike Curry, who sits as the International Bar Association's Anti-Corruption Committee Regional Representative for Africa, will moderate today's discussion. I'd like to extend a special word of thanks to Mike in putting together our panel. I know Mike has been the forefront of several advocacy initiatives which relate very closely to certain of the key recommendations and has also advised a number of our clients in complex cross-border corruption matters. Thank you again and welcome to tonight's panel.
Thank you, John. And on behalf of the International Bar Association, very warm welcome to everyone, and particularly the Anti-Corruption Committee members. I think just some housekeeping rules. Anyone who has questions, particularly the virtual attendees, please shoot them through. We'll try and feed those questions to the panelists as we progress the discussion. So this session is really inspired on behalf of a project rollout by the IBA. It's a global initiative to encourage countries to use and implement non-trial resolutions. As one of the key hallmarks of the recent OECD recommendations and a new element to the recommendations. And I think, as John said, particularly timely. But I think the OECD recommendations contain many elements to it that are very much topical to South Africa at the moment, to what's being constantly debated in the press by any anti-corruption practitioners, and of course emanating largely from what we've seen come out of the Zondo Commission and the recommendations contained therein. I think there's also, the OECD recommendations, which we'll unpack, are also very much principle-based. It's really up to the countries to decide how best to implement those measures as effectively as possible. And I think, importantly, and the one message we really wanted to get across on today's session is the role of the private sector in this. A lot of the policies, the tools and mechanisms that are to be used in pursuit of the OECD recommendations require not only buy-in from the private sector, but input. A lot of the policies are designed to ultimately detect and deter wrongdoing within private sector. And it's not just the responsibility of the public sector and government to implement these recommendations, but I think it goes very much hand in hand with the private sector. And I think for that reason, it's fantastic to have a panel, unfortunately not all here in person, but certainly that's so engaged in this topic, so diverse. To have the minister on board is fantastic, but also top judicial minds, very experienced heads, and great to have business here as well. So to get straight into it, I really want to hand over to Drago Cross first, chair of the OECD working group, to just give a snapshot on these recommendations, a little bit of background to them, why these new recommendations were published, what were the key elements of it, and what this means for South Africa. Albeit not an OECD member state, we are still bound by these recommendations. And Drago, if you could perhaps sketch some background for the audience as to why these OECD recommendations came about and what their relevance is, and also touch on the monitoring of these recommendations. That would be great.
Minister, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is really an honor for me to be here with you today. And I have to say immediately, I cannot avoid the temptation to say something as in the capacity of the working group chair, listening to introductory speeches. The working group is satisfied with South Africa's development in the area of legislation and institutions, but we are deeply concerned because of the lack of the enforcement. This is, I heard today, it's not new for you. And we are pushing really hard the country to do something in this area. We even agreed now on a technical mission, which means that we will be sending our, let's say, some of our best experts to assist your experts in doing what is necessary to start engaging more in the enforcement of the not only OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, but also all other provisions fighting corruption. So I really hope that things will improve soon. If not, I'm afraid that the working group will have to tighten the grip, which is never a very pleasant exercise for the country in question. And now to the recommendation. Contrary to what you might expect, the working group spent almost 3 years discussing, is there a need to have a new recommendation or not? Finally, in March 2018, we managed to agree that we need a new recommendation, mainly due to the new developments in this area, but also mainly due to, let's say, some new topics which have emerged from anywhere. And we said that we will simply have to deal with it. So we spent roughly 4 years first identifying topics for the recommendation. Of course, we reached out to our external partners too. And when we started discussing the topics, we repeated the exercise, meaning reaching out to external stakeholders twice. Plus, there were numerous other opportunities for them to get in touch with us and to send us either online or through written texts their input of their, let's say, wishes of what would have to be covered with the text of the recommendation. We finalized the text in November. We had a series of special meetings devoted only to negotiations on the recommendation. It could be better because legal text could always be better in ideal world, but since we don't live in ideal world, I have to say I'm reasonably satisfied with what we got. If nothing else, we have dealt with some important new institutes and which will give rise, let's say, to hopefully many activities of the countries, but also of companies. But they will also enable the working group to continue its monitoring role in the 5th or maybe even later on the 6th phase of evaluations. So what are the new topics which have been included in the recommendation? For the first time in the preamble, we mentioned the gender equality issue, and we also mentioned the importance of new technologies. Those two topics, I'm sure that in years to come, they will move from the preamble into the substantive part of the recommendation with some clear provisions taking into account both topics, which will mean that, of course, countries will have to do something in those two areas too. But in the substantial part of the recommendation, we have, for the first time ever, we have dealt with the demand side to foreign bribery cases. I'm sure you know that the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention only deals with supply side. Since following our research from 2018 or 19, we found out that only in 20% of cases where the bribe payers are sanctioned, also the bribe recipients are sanctioned, it became clear to us that we have to do something in this area. So, of course, we could not introduce a criminal offense of accepting bribes, because that would mean that we are going far from convention. But we introduced many things, asking countries to address the solicitation and acceptance of bribes, and better support companies which are facing bribe solicitation risks. We dealt significantly with sanctions and confiscations, especially in the area of identifying, freezing, seizing, and confiscating bribes in the process of foreign bribery. The brand new topic is non-prior solutions. You will hear of them today extensively. So I will not spend too much time on that one. I have to say that thanks to so-called recommendation 6 group, we got very qualitative input from our external stakeholders, our friends, and it was not too problematic for us to draft those provisions. And it was basically, we had the only hiccup at the beginning where some countries were very clear in saying that if we will try to introduce NTRs as mandatory for the countries, they will not agree with the text. So it's still optional. Countries can decide to have them or not, but when they decide to have them, then they have to follow our rules. International cooperation is much more developed now as it was before. For the first time, again, we also introduced the rules on protection of reporting persons. Now, following extensive study some years ago, we found that it is simply not enough to tell the required countries to protect whistleblowers without telling them how to do it. So this time we are telling countries how to protect whistleblowers in the public, but also in the private sector. Also, for the first time, we have introduced incentives for compliance. Now, we constantly, in discussions with the private sector, we heard objections from basic representatives of the companies saying, well, no, development on effective compliance mechanisms sometimes costs millions. So it happens that sometimes if the mechanism is really an effective one, that there are no cases of corruption, companies simply do not see any benefits from that. So this time we are asking countries to incentivize companies by offering them different let's say benefits in the area of public procurement, official development, assistance, and so on. Hopefully this will help companies to make the decision on compliance systems easily. We also tackled upon the issue of data protection, not in the sense that we would be emphasizing data protection so much, but contrary to that, we said that international cooperation, effectiveness of anti-corruption internal controls, ethics, and compliance should not be impeded by data protection rules and privacy rights. Though my personal opinion still is that in the last years we were going too much into one direction, which means protection of privacy, and we are forgetting everything else. And we suddenly found ourselves in this situation. And when I say we now, I mean law enforcement agencies, but also, let's say, compliance officers in the companies, that suddenly the data protection rules turned into an obstacle for our work. So we want to have a balanced approach, and this is what we are clearly saying in our recommendation. Those were the new topics. Of course, we also broadened or deepened some provisions on topics which existed before. We updated the list of relevant OECD legal instruments which are addressing corruption, because there are some other instruments too which were adopted in previous years. We put much more emphasis on the enforcement, awareness raising, and training and guidance. So we really hope that this time, well, already the 2000 recommendation was a very good legal document. We also hope that this time, this one will be equally useful and important. And most of all, that it will enable and really motivate private sector to join forces with the public sector in fighting international bribery. I have to say, private sector never had too big problems with that. Contrary to that, I saw many countries, many governments saying, well, the companies are the bad guys, and they should only be sanctioned, and they should not be taken into account as partners. So I hope really that with this text, which we have in the recommendation now, this is now changing insignificantly. Although the recommendation has been adopted by the Council of the OECD, it is also mandatory text for the working group members, also for countries which are not members of the OECD yet. As you know, we have in the working group, we have countries which are members of the OECD plus 8 other countries. I think there are 8. According to the text of recommendation, the recommendation is mandatory for all members of the working group, which also includes South Africa, and the working group is mandated to monitor its enforcement. We are already starting gradual monitoring of the enforcement of the recommendation. Of course, first with the topics which do not take too much time to be for implementation. Full-scale monitoring will start with phase 5. But until then, we really hope that those parts of the recommendation, which are not too difficult for the implementation, will be implemented already. And countries which will be undergoing our monitoring from now on will already face some questions on the implementation of this recommendation. I will stop here because I know that we have excellent group of experts discussing particular parts of the recommendation, but I'll be very happy to answer any questions afterwards.
Thank you, Drago. Thank you, Drago. That's very helpful and a great overview. Minister Lamola, I wanted to get your thoughts up front. I know we're going to be unpacking certain of these recommendations in some more detail. You and your department are obviously grappling with several of the recommendations, be it just ordinary issues, be it issues that have come out from the Zondo Commission or the like. What is your department? How are you approaching these recommendations? What extent have you and your team grappled with these issues and the new recommendations in particular? And do you have a strategy on how you propose implementing these? Could you give us sort of some background from you and your department's perspective?
We are approaching them in the context of the Zondo Commission's recommendations. From our perspective, these recommendations have come at a timely manner, in that we are currently looking at all the recommendations from the Zondo Commission. And as you are aware, it's voluminous recommendations which are also becoming clear to us, but it will be practically difficult to do them without some of the mechanisms that are available to other jurisdictions in the world, which includes some of the recommendations that the OECD is making in terms of the settlement kind of agreements that we currently have in South Africa, which some of them have been done outside the Criminal Procedure Act, but in a civil kind of proceedings, which has led to some of the monies being recovered in terms of billions of rands from some of the big multilaterals. But the issue of the deferrals and the issue of the settlement is something that we're also looking into, whether this is something that could be helpful deal with some of these matters, particularly that we also have a very tight time frame to report to Parliament as to how we're going to deal with the recommendations of the Zondo Commission. And we are looking at these recommendations favorable because we do think that we do need some of the mechanisms that could help us with these multilateral companies to cooperate with our law enforcement agencies in our country to be able to help uncover some of the issues that might be hidden or only known by these multilateral companies that span various jurisdictions. So it is something which is still at a very embryo stage, but looked at very deeply within ourselves, and hopefully soon we will be coming up with clear recommendations that we will be taking to Parliament in line with the Zondo Commission's report, which will obviously also be responding to the OECD's recommendations, because we look at it as a parallel or intertwined process from our side. I hope I've responded to your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. I think that's very helpful indeed, and I think that's a good segue into really what is one of the key topics of this session, which is exploring the use of non-trial resolutions. You mentioned that there's sort of been a quasi or informal use of them to some extent already by companies in South Africa, and there seems to be, I suppose, somewhat of a mixed reaction to that. Certainly one of the OECD recommendations is to have a far more formalized and transparent and objective non-trial resolution regime. And I think it would be helpful here to get both Jennifer and Peter, both from talking largely from a US and an international perspective, to give us a sense of the key hallmarks of non-trial resolutions. There's often different terminology: deferred prosecuting agreements, settlement agreements. But really, what is a hallmark of a non-trial resolution regime, and which models do you think are the most effective, and what would you say are the key hallmarks and facets of an effective regime?
Thank you so much for inviting me to join this distinguished group and my distinguished panelists. And I just wanted to give a brief bit of context on what it is, why we need non-trial resolutions, and what I think are some of the most effective ways to use them. And I start with a simple fact, which is that corporate crime, whether it is corruption or fraud or environmental harms, is disturbingly common because corporate criminal law has not deterred effectively, and that's actually true all around the world. Employees and companies get a lot of benefit from violating the law, and they're not deterred adequately by the threat of criminal sanctions because, quite frankly, they don't expect to get caught. And both economics and psychology has shown that the single biggest challenge to deterrence is to make sure that the probability of getting caught is high enough that the people committing crimes take it into account. Because right now, employees just ignore the risk. Countries can use companies to fix this problem. Truth is, countries can use companies to fix two problems. One is the benefit to employees of misconduct because they benefit as a result of the way companies structure compensation and promotion policies. But what I want to focus on is that companies are able to detect misconduct that countries cannot. And Eugene Soltis at the Harvard Business School has an excellent piece that looked at 3 publicly held companies' internal reporting systems and found an extraordinary incidence of substantiated misconduct by 3 companies that, as far as enforcement officials were concerned, had committed no misconduct. And if you extrapolate that out, you get a sense of how much misconduct is happening. They can detect where the government cannot and regularly do. They are far better able to investigate and obtain evidence because they have all their own data and information. And it's also the case that psychology shows that if you want to deter through norms, it's the company that actually creates the norm that employees live. So we need companies on the side of deterrence. That means criminal enforcement has to get companies to want to deter, but not just to want to deter, but to want to detect, self-report, give the information to the government, and to fully cooperate by providing evidence. And it has to be evidence not just about the misconduct, but also about the individuals. And then, and I think this responds to the question, this only works if the government not only incentivizes self-reporting and full cooperation, but then goes after the individual wrongdoers on both the supply and the demand side. That is absolutely vital. But we don't get to the point where we could go after the individuals if we don't structure the liability to induce, to reward self-reporting, full cooperation, and remediation. And when I say remediation, it's not just disgorging the benefit of the misconduct, fixing your compliance program, but also disciplining the individuals within the firm who were responsible, either by committing the crime or condoning it. You can use non-trial resolutions to do this, and they need to take multiple forms, not just guilty pleas, which are a non-trial resolution, but also non-prosecution agreements where you don't even charge the firm, but you can still ask it to disgorge all of its profits, and deferred prosecution agreements where you charge the firm, but you agree not to convict it as long as the firm takes certain steps and you oversee it for 3 years. One effective way to do this is to say to companies, if you self-report, fully cooperate, remediate, and disgorge all the benefit of the crime, we won't prosecute at all, or we'll use a non-prosecution agreement just to ensure that you cooperate against the individuals. But notice that's not a get-out-of-jail-free card for the company because it still has to disgorge the profit. If you fully cooperate and remediate, but you don't self-report, we'll incentivize the cooperation by giving you a deferred prosecution agreement. Again, you disgorge the profit with either no fine or a very low fine to get you to investigate and fully cooperate. And notice this will also encourage compliance because it's very hard to investigate and fully cooperate if you don't have a good compliance program. And very important, if you do none of these things, then the government should throw all its resources at obtaining a conviction. This is very important. Companies that do not self-report and do not cooperate must be very afraid of the government, and the government should not say, we'll give you a nice non-trial resolution with no conviction if you just agree to settle quickly, because that will undermine the whole system. The government has to say, if you don't self-report or fully cooperate, the best you'll get is a guilty plea with high sanctions. Now, I want to leave time for the others. Just a word on why the company has to also disgorge the profit. You have to make sure that companies don't profit from crime, not only so that they'll want to have an effective compliance program, but you need to get companies to look at their compensation and promotion policies, to want to discipline wrongdoers, and to change their culture. And the final thing is, this system only works if companies are afraid that if they don't self-report and cooperate, they'll get caught and convicted anyway. So you need adequate funding for enforcement, expert investigative teams specialized in corporate cases who know how to follow the money, and whistleblowing is terribly important. Not only protections for whistleblowers, but rewards, both to compensate them for the cost, but rewards also can enable whistleblowers to hire lawyers to help them investigate so that they can be more effective when they blow the whistle. Thank you very much, Peter.
Well, thank you. My name is Peter Solmson. I was just introduced. I've been an executive officer and the general counsel of 3 large multinationals. And in all of them, we found that these incentives worked both externally and internally. At all 3 companies, we had very robust audit and compliance processes. We had hotlines for whistleblowers, and we tried to engage in voluntary disclosure and cooperation wherever we could. And we realized that we experienced better financial and operational results when we had that strategy. And the fact of the matter is, if you are doing business internationally, if you're doing business over a period of time, it's simply the law of large numbers, the law of statistics, that you will have problems with bribery, corruption, and other crimes. And to believe that good leadership is enough is just being an ostrich. And I think any company doing business internationally ought to be prepared to have the kind of robust processes that enable a company to take advantage of the leniency programs that exist formally and informally all around the world. And I encourage the South African colleagues in the room here and the politicians to look very hard at getting this right. We found that when we brought in the wrongdoers, we found that when we brought in the evidence and were rewarded for it, it made good business sense for us. And I'll finish with one little anecdote. At the last company where I was the general counsel, we had a potential problem of about $300 million, not in the corruption area, actually in the export control world. And you'll see that this practice of self-disclosure, voluntary disclosure, is in virtually all areas. That I think the competition people invented it. We disclosed quickly, we remediated, we disgorged, we provided evidence, and the whole problem ended up costing us, including legal fees and audit fees, about $300,000. Now, when you're talking to your colleagues around the table about how to budget, how to plan, how to structure your processes, that kind of experience reinforces the business sense of having a good compliance process, having good audits, and having a good strategy for cooperation with government. So I will leave it there and move back to Mr. Curry.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Peter. That's very useful background insight. I mean, the Zondo Commission, or the recommendations, certainly talk about deferred prosecution agreements as one form of non-trial resolutions, and underpinning that is the use of sort of restorative justice. It's one of the constitutional, or one of the principles enshrined in our constitution, allowing companies and firms to come forward, be transparent, be cooperative, and be forthcoming. So there's certainly a good principle foundation for that. Jennifer, I think you've already flagged what would probably be most people's concern with non-trial resolutions is, can it be used as an opportunity for firms to really sort of the get out of jail free card? Is it going to be enough of a deterrent to ensure that the company itself doesn't engage in continuous wrongdoing, but also send a strong enough message to other companies out there? And I think there's a number of facets to it. There seems to be a couple of mutually reinforcing elements to it as well. One being particularly in the context of South Africa, where we know resource and capacity constraints are high, where the prosecuting authorities are emboldened by concluding successful non-trial resolution, non-settlements, actually getting funds back, and can actually then focus not only their time and efforts, but also the resources in going after those firms who are either not being cooperative or not willing to engage in these types of processes. That certainly lengthens the stick, so to speak, as well as incentivizes the carrot. And I think that was your opening remark, Jennifer, that you need to have both the carrot and the stick system for any non-trial resolution mechanism to work. Companies need to know that the alternative of not cooperating, not taking opportunity of being transparent, there is actually a downside and a backlash. I want to get the rest of the panelists' thoughts on this. I want to start with Willie and Professor Shorpe. I know both of you have, in our previous discussions leading up to the session, expressed some reservations, not necessarily being anti-non-trial resolution, but certainly some reservations and risks. And get your thoughts not only on what those are, but how best to possibly address those very much from a South African perspective. And I think just in saying that, we've obviously got guilty pleas in terms of Criminal Procedure Act, one form of non-trial resolution mentioned, but the ability for the National Prosecuting Authority to conclude non-trial resolutions, possibly even before pressing criminal charges, would of course be an important thing to debate as well. But I'll hand over maybe first to
Okay, I'm going to come in from a slightly different angle, which may be more specific to South Africa's situation. But the suggestion I have been lobbying for a bit here is to use a technology called voice stress analysis on the key people in the state who has the power, to have the power to procure. And essentially what it is, we have a body called a Special Investigating Unit in South Africa. They've been using this technology for a very long time. It's called voice stress analysis or voice layered analysis in some cases. But essentially my proposal is that if you put the key people in the procurement process in the state in a professional body that has the power to discipline them if they do something wrong. For example, our lawyers at the moment already, the private sector bar can disbar lawyers in the state from practicing further. So I think if one can look at something like that, but my key proposal really is to use the voice stress analysis technology on the top 3 layers of the procurement process in the state. So that's, in our case, the accounting officer, the chief financial officer, the head of procurement. And I think if one can set up a proper process that prevents them from doing the wrong thing in the first place, partly because they are scared that they will be caught, because they will be caught, but also in combination with a much better whistleblower program than most countries have. So I think one needs, my suggestion for South Africa is that we use some retired constitutional court judges to head a whistleblower program, and you give them a lot of power to force law enforcement to go and investigate the cases that gets reported to them under their supervision, for instance. So I think if you can get a combination of securing the integrity of the key people in the supply chain management process, plus a proper whistleblower program, I think we can solve or prevent most of corruption from actually happening in the first place. And why I think that is important is that we all know to prosecute corruption cases is long, complicated, very resource intensive. And so I think the extent to which one can put in those processes in place, and as I said, we've used it in South Africa quite a long time in the Special Investigating Unit. There's been no constitutional or legal challenges to this process at the Special Investigating Unit. So in short, I'm just saying, prosecuting corruption cases or any economic crime cases is long, complicated, and difficult. To some degree, I think we need to give a lot more attention to how we secure the integrity of the people in the supply chain management process. And that will take a huge amount of pressure off law enforcement in terms of the number of cases they end up having to deal with. So fairly short and sweet, but that is my pearls of wisdom for the day.
Thanks, Billy. So, I mean, you've jumped the gun on a number of topics, which I think we want to unpack, and I think you've raised a lot of interesting points. Before we get back to non-trial resolutions, to pick up on your suggestion of in the supply chain having a quasi, like the legal profession has a bar. Do I understand your proposal correctly that we need to set up an actual professional body in the supply chain and have that body have the power to discipline members? There needs to be some sort of test, if you like, board exams, something similar to ensure that those who are involved in supply chains are up to scratch.
Yeah, and I think one of the advantages in South Africa is that our lawyers basically are part of the same bar as the private sector. So the issue of disciplining people is not only in the hands of the state, which may be captured as it has been in South Africa in the past, so that you have an independent body essentially that can say this person is not fit for the job. They're not going to be allowed to work, at least in the state, but I would argue in the private sector as well in this area.
Professor Schulpe, I'm going to ask you to give your thoughts on this latter point when we discuss the sort of demand side of corruption, and whether you think this is a feasible and good idea. But I want to round off the discussion on non-trial resolutions. I don't know if you have any thoughts, and then I'm going to get Judge Davis your thoughts on this, and particularly whether or not any non-trial resolution regime is something which should be subject to judicial oversight, whether that creates an additional burden on courts, whether courts should just simply trust the NPA that it will, conclude objective agreements. But let me first get Professor Schulpe's views on non-trial resolutions.
Thank you very much, Mike. My name is Shokwe William Selegbe, and I'm a professor of public procurement law at Stellenbosch University. So I'll just say a few things, and I'll come at it from the public procurement angle. So the first thing, so non-trial resolutions, they have their place, and they're good in the sense that they help to avoid the collateral damage that can sometimes happen to companies, when they go through the criminal justice system, and they also, conserve judicial resources. If you look at what happened with Arthur Anderson, for those of you that can remember that time, so they have their place. But there's some other, I should say, sticking points that many systems don't give adequate attention to. So the first is that non-trial resolutions have an impact on the debarment system in public procurement. Many countries rely on a conviction for companies that have, committed illegal or unethical practices to be debarred. Now, if you enter into a non-trial resolution and that conviction is removed, so to speak, then you still remain liable in many countries to have access. You still remain able to have access to government contracts because you're not going to be debarred. And that is from the public point of view, the optics of that don't look good, right? So that's something that we have to think about. And beyond the optics, it's like, okay, is this something that we really want to happen? In some countries, you have, especially very big companies who have entered into non-trial resolutions, recommit offenses. So there's some degree of corporate recidivism. And in later offenses, their earlier conduct isn't taken into account in terms of sanctioning and disciplining them. So that's something that also needs to be considered. Then many times you find that big companies can enter into non-trial resolutions because they have the sophisticated law firms behind them, where smaller firms don't. And that also creates an optical problem of, are these firms able to quote and unquote buy their way out of justice, which is why the point that Jennifer mentioned about making sure that governments still pursue or criminal justice still pursues custodial sentences against culpable individuals is really, really important. The other thing that I like to talk about from the South African perspective, what we've had in the past, is that in terms of corporate disclosure, companies haven't been very sincere, if I can say that. So if I give the example of Bain, for instance, when they came out with their own investigation on what happened, it was laughable. And it created a whole new set of problems. So corporate disclosure hasn't had a good track record in South Africa. And there have been a few other companies that were implicated in state capture that were also, not as sincere as one would have hoped that they would be. So we need to think about this. And I think the other thing that is important for me is, like, if we institute this in South Africa, what do we really mean in terms of restitution? So the events that we've had in the recent past, you've had these companies returning the fees that they were paid when they engaged in their state capturing activities, but that doesn't really meet the damage that was caused to South Africa, to society, to the enterprise, to the organs of state that they were engaged with. So what do we really mean by this type of disgorgement? How far does it go, especially seeing that the damage that has been inflicted in South Africa, especially in the recent past, is very different from what has happened in countries like, the UK or the US, and the kinds of damage that they, that they had on in terms of their own corporate bribery and corruption. So I think those are the things that are of concern to me. And I think these are issues that obviously the Minister of Justice and his team would have to think about as they implement these recommendations. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I want to get back to one of the remarks you made, but I'm first going to hand over to Judge Davis.
Yeah, there's a lot of what Professor Williams-Legbe said, I agree with entirely. So let me just assume that for the purpose of debate, which is this, that there is a series of distinctions we need to draw between, let us say, future safeguards and present action. By which I mean, I think the idea of using Willie Hofmeier's idea is an ex-distinguished student of mine, so I reluctant to criticize anything he says. Not that he ever learned anything from me, but that's another matter. I think he's quite right. That's a proactive issue. I only would say this, Willie, I don't think you could only have to use constitutional court judges. That's not that I'm looking for a job, I assure you. But I do think that there's some very, very talented, commercially literate judges. And that's really important, right across the board who've retired, who could be used for this process. And I think that's a great idea. I'd like to reinforce that. In relation to the comments made by Jennifer Ireland, whose work I'm well acquainted with because I teach some of it, when I teach corporate governance, and it's some of your articles are absolutely fabulous. But I think I actually heard you speak at NYU when I was lecturing, when I was a visiting professor there just a couple of years ago. I agree entirely, but your argument is an extremely nuanced one, and one shouldn't elide over the nuance, which is that whilst protect the kind of alternative measures that you're talking about are absolutely vital in relation going forward, and maybe even in relation to the present, there are significant desires in South Africa for people, as it were, to be put into orange overalls, who have stolen the 1.5 trillion, which we estimate is probably the case. And to give context to my international friends, that's roughly equals to 1 year of our tax revenue, which is an extraordinary sum of money when you think it through, for a country desperate to reconstruct itself from the ravages and racism of apartheid. So the question that then arises, Michael, is, well, what do we should be using a bifurcated approach. I certainly think what Jennifer has proposed needs to be looked at, and if we can kind of have that approach, which we can draw in the private sector, so much the better. But the problem is that the private sector in this country are so deeply implicated in state capture, I should tell you. Let me give you just a couple of examples without actually speaking about entities, but very prominent ones. If you look at the Zondo Commissioner report, a couple of banks, very serious commercial banks, have been highlighted not once but many times. And what is significant about those banks is that the work when I'm doing for the South African Revenue Service as a consultant now to try to deal with tax evasion, the same characters come up yet again. And so I have doubts, that how far they'll go, although it does seem to me that this is a supreme argument as well for corporate governance, that the CEOs and the chief executive officer and finance officers of these organizations should actually be fired, and that there should be a reassertion of corporate governance, and then perhaps at the same time, the kind of programmatic that Jennifer is speaking about. But then that raises the further point, Michael, which I think you basically asked me to deal with, albeit briefly, but we could spend an entire conference on this, which is that when you're talking about the situation in South Africa, to give but one soup song of a detail, I've got, as part of our little team at SARS, we have worked through the 3 Zondo reports. There are roughly 550 people. I'm not talking about entities, 550 people plus entities who are implicated in the 3 reports. Each of these needs investigation. Each of these needs to be examined properly. Now, The South African Revenue Service should be, of course, doing part of that, and that's part of the Al Capone strategy. But again, it's under-resourced. And of course, many of these cases will have to land up in court one way or the other, which I think would also concentrate the mind in regard to the kind of alternative strategies Jennifer is speaking about. And I say this with many, many years of experience of being the retired judge president of the Competition Appeal Court in South Africa, and the way in which our leniency program has worked to flush out cartels. But that's a story of its own. But in relation to the NPI, I can't help but make this remark. In the introduction, it was suggested quite commendably that the private sector is prepared to assist by getting people from the bar to perhaps lead cases. Well, that's all very well and good. If one can find sufficient, and there are talented commercial and criminal advocates who could lead these cases. But you don't get a case simply through an advocate. You've got to build that case up. You need forensic investigators. You need, and Jennifer's prefigured that thing. You need people who know how to deal with convoluted structures which have placed money all over the world and all sorts of strange trusts and companies and so on and so forth. And so the problem is not even money. The problem is not just getting the right people to actually appear in front of judges and explain to judges, many of whom will be confronted for the first time with the level of complexity of this kind of case simply because we've brought so few of them over the past number of years. The problem is actually getting the right people in at the floor level to investigate and to actually deal with these cases so that the cases are brought in a way that they can be successful. And I'm sorry to say, I'm not sanguine about that. I really am not sanguine about that. And if we fail there, the whole scheme fails. So there's a desperation in us looking at this holistically from, as it were, Willie's point, the issues that Jennifer has raised, and in fact, a ability to essentially for the NPA to understand it's going to have to use right from the floor level upwards, private sector, forensic people and experts. And I wanted to say, I see no reason, having read the judgment which deals with called the Heath judgment, that retired judges can't have a major contribution to play in this particular all hands to the deck scenario. Because frankly, if we don't hold some of these people accountable, then the entire concept of the rule of law and criminal law in South Africa is placed in extraordinary jeopardy, as is our entire constitutional enterprise, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Judge. A lot of food for thought there. I mean, I wanted to play devil's advocate, and this is probably because I personally sit on the side of advising corporations and advising, representing a lot of the individuals who might sit on the other side of the fence, so to speak. And while there's certainly a need from a public interest perspective and from a prosecuting perspective to get matters to trial and get results, there's also an interest for companies to have finality and certainty. There's also a risk, we've certainly seen this a number of cases we've been involved in, where I think companies are often painted with the same tainted brush, and everyone is sort of close to the fire gets smoked out, and I don't think that's necessarily fair. And the only way for companies and individuals to actually not necessarily clear their name, but rebut perhaps an adverse or an unfair media or public narrative about them is to have full transparency. And I think that ties very much into the support of having a objective, transparent, non-trial resolution mechanism. It also, of course, deals with the practical concerns that you raise, that we just don't have not only the resources, but the capacity, the skill set, and we haven't yet, I think, found a good balance between getting the private sector involved to actually tangibly assist, although that's certainly in the pipelines in a number of initiatives. I know John's going to be speaking about that as well. Minister Lamola, the use of non-trial resolution is, of course, not new. We know the National Prosecuting Authority has touched on it, has raised this in Parliament. What from the department side and your engagements with the NPA and your view are the key impediments that would need to be addressed in order to actually implement an effective non-trial resolution mechanism or regime or deferred prosecution regime? And do you have any comments to what you've heard today in terms of how to structure it and what are the key objectives of that regime?
Yeah, no, thank you. Firstly, maybe to say that I agree entirely with what the Prof said. I think it's Professor Sebe. And the reality is that in South Africa, you will be dealing with this in a different and unique context, which has also been clearly painted by the last report of the World Bank, when he stated that this is number one unequal society in the world. When you deal with corporate bodies, particularly the big, huge multilaterals in our country, you are dealing also with a situation where the country comes from a history of racism. When you handle these matters, obviously the big corporate executives and the shareholders are in their majority white. And in the face of the public, it is viewed as if we are being lenient to big corporates, and you are, when you go to the black executives who are majority, those that are in government and the officials who then end up with sentences in jail, and on the other side with corporates that end up with only non-trial resolutions kind of resolutions, which is what we are currently facing with the McKinsey situation, where they had to pay a 1.1 billion back into Transnet and Eskom, and the Bain issue, where they had to pay a total of about 217 million. And also the ABB, which has paid about 1.5 billion. The biggest echo in the country is that, yes, we see these amounts, but what follows then? Why are they not being taken through in terms of prosecution, being seen in jail, some of these executives and so forth? So you are dealing with also a very difficult political environment. So as you deal with these legislations, those are issues that we have to consider. And obviously, the Prof, I think she has laid a number of them down. The damage that has been caused, for example, through Bain and SARS, which has taken them some time to recover to be where they are now. I think they are still not where they used to be able to collect revenue, to perform at a level which SARS is supposed to perform to help the fiscus to sustain itself. Eskom, the struggles of load shedding, which is causing huge damage to the economy. It's well documented, and we are still reeling from that years of capture of that institution. Transnet still struggling with the railway lines and the locomotives going into dealing with issues of exports as we speak now, struggling with some of the export that was supposed to be carried through Eskom line, which were going to play a key role to help the economy to recover. So all that context becomes very important for us as we consider all these factors and all these recommendations that are coming through. In the eyes of the public, they will only believe that there's justice when the money is recovered, but also when they've seen some of these top executives or those that were involved going to jail. So that is a balancing act that we will obviously have to look into as we look into the Zondo Commission's recommendations. Obviously, the President now has to report to Parliament in August, and we are dealing with these recommendations, as I've said earlier on, as a parallel or together from yourself and also these commissions from Zondo, so that we are able to also take from international best practice, but it will also be taken with a high consideration in the context of our unique circumstances as a country. And obviously it will be difficult to just have a copy and paste. We'll have to apply our minds and be very careful that whatever tools and mechanisms that are coming in are uniquely suitable and tailor-made for for the unique situation of the South African context. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. And I mean, I think those are all well understood. I mean, the essential element there really is that there seems to be a very clear, transparent regime for there to ever be trust that this isn't a politically influenced, politically tainted, or politically skewed a system. And I think certainly on behalf of the IBA, and I think I can make this proffer on behalf of the OECD as well, there would certainly be a willingness to engage the department and whoever else needs to be to share experiences, share lessons, and assist where we can. I want to move.
Maybe one last comment on what Judge Davis said with regards to obviously in yourself that there are capable advocates out there who are willing to help. I think one of the challenges obviously is that we do have what is called Section 38 in terms of the NPA Act, where we're able to rope in advocates from the profession to come and help us. And as you will have seen, the cost that the Zondo commissions have ballooned to about R1 billion. And we anticipate that if there is no properly structured fee agreement, also mixed with also them, those that are in practice, also seeing this as a service to the nation, we may not be able to afford the fees. If you looked at them, if we had agreed at a fee that is it's also mixed with some kind of service to the nation, even for the Zondo Commission, we might not have reached this R1 billion. And when you look at some of these matters, when Judge Davis says about 537 matters of interest, and there will also be many matters that will come up. So you will then realize that this cost may go beyond that billion of the commission just to deal with these matters in the Commercial Crimes Court and also in the High Court. So this non-trial resolution, as you said, transparent, but also looking at that kind of aspect will be, it's one of the discussions we're currently having with the National Treasury and also the NPA, but also looking at how do we also ensure that the NPA is insulated from any perception of bias when they bring in resources from outside the state to help the prosecuting authority to prosecute some of these matters, because the state has to guarantee the independence of the NPA through ensuring that we provide the resources that are needed. But as you will have seen, the resources that may be needed to deal with this matter going forward may be far above what the fiscals can handle. And that is the discussion that is currently happening. Maybe you could also be having some experiences in this kind of matters. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. I think all very valid points and well noted. I was going to move on to sort of the section on whistleblowing, but I first actually want to get John involved. The Minister's touched on the role and initiatives of the private sector. You here in your capacity as a board member of Business Unity South Africa. Could you give us some sense of what is from BUSA and business side, some of the initiatives you guys are busy with, and your thoughts on business's role in what you've heard today?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mike, and greetings to the Minister and every one of the panelists. I feel a bit ganged up on as the only member of the private sector here. But let me say a few things before I go into responding to your question. The first one, I think, is to encourage the IBA, Primario, and the OECD in this ongoing work. Fighting corruption is not an event, it's a process and it's an ongoing exercise. It's like productivity improvements in business. You can't just wake up one day with a magic wand and hope that it goes away overnight. I should also say that I'm quite encouraged by the Minister's remarks that even in a difficult year as this one, where the ruling party is facing an elective and a turbulent conference towards the end of the year, there is a very clear commitment by government to continue the fight against corruption. And this is a very important message that I hope can be repeated as the president goes into his fourth edition of the International Investment Council. It's to give a clear signal that this fight won't be let up and that government will remain resolute on it. Let me say, on the 28th of January this year, we met with the president and we raised a few issues there. One of the issues that we raised was the crisis of corruption in our country. And we did not raise this crisis of corruption in apportioning blame to say that the public sector is to blame for this epidemic of corruption. We went there as patriots, and I've got a colleague here, Stavros Nikolaou, who could testify to the tone of that engagement with the president, that we went there as patriots to say that we're in this together, and we are here to lend a hand. I think this was the subject and theme of his inaugural State of the Nation address. We extended a hand of help to the government to say that we're here, we're all affected by this problem, and we're willing to work with you. A few days later, of course, Judge Zondo, the Chief Justice designate now, released the recommendations of his first part of the three-part series of reports. And I think it's very important. My colleagues in business will not forgive me if I did not push back on what I thought was a sense of cynicism about business commitment to fighting corruption. We released a statement as Business Unity South Africa. A part of the statement read as follows, and I would like to read it onto the record. BUSA supports all the recommendations in the report under Section J of the report, starting from page 844. We discussed in particular the issue of protection of whistleblowers and the role that business could play in addressing the dire circumstances of the whistleblowers find themselves. We will work with government and other social partners to contribute to the urgent implementation of the recommendations contained in the report. It went on to say, we will look at some initiatives underway to bolster the capacity of the National Prosecuting Authority. We'll coordinate initiatives by our members into a serious and concerted mechanism to provide necessary resources to the NPA to urgently prepare cases to prosecute those identified in the report. Such resources could include private prosecutions or private prosecutors and other relevant assistance. We will engage the NPA about this. The BUSA board has also asked relevant members to urgently engage with any business mentioned in the report in order to get a full briefing from those businesses that are affected about the allegations proffered against them, and to understand what actions those businesses intend taking. In conclusion, we must emphasize that we will address the outcomes of Part 1 of the Zondo Commission's report with the seriousness and agency it deserves. We are, however, an organization of business associations and have the responsibility to engage members and ensure due process in arriving at a mandated position of the report. We are processing this with utmost agency. So I think this is the commitment that you should hold us as business to. First, as an apex organization in South Africa, business organization, and then, of course, the individual affiliates of BUSA, and going down into the individual businesses. I know what Judge Davis has raised, but we have to tread cautiously. Our private sector is fragile. We cannot have prolonged periods of uncertainty. Otherwise, we'll wake up one day and have a situation where there is a run on the banks. We should allow due process to take place. And I believe that we have due process. All our members are seized with this. For example, from a small business institute point of view, we are exposed and do business with two organizations. I have had a CEO to go to them and ask for explanations about the remedial actions that they are taking following them being implicated in the report. Let me make just one final remark that I believe that since 2017, there has been a course correction from business. It has been faltering in certain instances, as we have seen with non-disclosure or false disclosure by other organizations. But quite a few steps cannot be overlooked, such as BLSA, Business Leadership South Africa, now requires all members to sign an integrity pledge. And business went into the public square to call out some of its members and suspend some of its members who were found wanting, whether it's in the public sector or in the private sector. And other associations and affiliates of BUSA are on record as having denied membership to applicants that have been found to have integrity issues. So what I'm saying here is, I'm saying we are here as business, to offer a helping hand to all the social partners. In us, you have willing and capable partners to walk this journey. I thank you. And I'm quite happy to sort of respond to other questions about what more could be done, especially in the area of protecting whistleblowers.
Thank you, John. I mean, I think it's encouraging to hear that you seem to think the tide has turned to some extent from a corporate culture perspective. And I think the initiatives which Bruce are undertaking are noble and should be applauded. You raised your latest remark on whistleblowing, which is one thing, key topic, not only in the OECD report that I want to focus on, but I think it's also highly topical from a South African perspective. It features in so many respects. And I think there is a implicit recognition that South Africa's current whistleblowing regime needs to be bolstered. It doesn't give the necessary protection to whistleblowers. It doesn't incentivize or encourage whistleblowers coming forward. And, it stems from both, Jennifer's opening remarks that even an effective non-trial resolution regime ultimately requires companies to have a more robust whistleblower regime in place. I think there is a less unanimous view in terms of what and how the whistleblowing regime should be bolstered in South Africa. Is it a US model where whistleblowers are potentially rewarded with, millions of dollars of compensation, a reward, a bounty, if you like, for disclosing wrongdoing? Or is it a more nuanced approach where you just, compensate a whistleblower for loss of income, for any other damages suffered, for coming forward? Whistleblowers, and I think certainly the US colleagues who are far more familiar with it from a United States perspective will confirm that the data is that suggests that the vast majority of whistleblowers try and report internally first. They don't want to go to the media houses. They don't want to go to authorities. They don't want they don't want to be publicly disclosed. So what I want to get the panel's thoughts on, and really quite quickly, is what are your views in terms of what is the appropriate whistleblower regime? What should it be in South Africa? What are the key features of it? Is it just rewards that we need to be looking at? Is rewards actually are we placing too much weight on the financial compensation for whistleblowers? Are there other areas? Is it safety issues that are more important? Where are the key pressure points for whistleblowers? And I'd be very, very interested in hearing the panel's thoughts on this, and then of course getting the minister's remarks on this topic as well. Vili, why don't we start from you? I see your hands up, and then we'll move across the panel.
Thank you. I do have a proposal for what I think would be a much more effective whistleblowing mechanism. Because at the moment, the reality is you are actually supposed to whistleblow to your boss, who's usually the one who's done the wrong thing. So my suggestion is we have a very credible group of people in South Africa who are retired constitutional court judges. They get paid for life, even though they're not active judges anymore. So my suggestion is that we should set up a whistleblower protection body headed by judges or retired judges from the Constitutional Court, and you give them some real powers that, for example, they can force law enforcement or instruct law enforcement to investigate the case under their supervision. But I do think that, the Constitutional Court judges are really the only credible institution that we have left in our country. And I think that they really can be utilized to set up a very, very good whistleblowing process, as long as one is willing to give them the powers. They are also, anyway, paid for life while they are alive. So the costs of such a mechanism will not be huge. But the current whistleblowing system is you're supposed to report to your boss, who's usually the one who's instructed the wrong things to happen. So I do think whistleblowing is an issue where we do need some urgent action to be taken. I think we have a moment of opportunity now when there's a lot of sort of public interest and so on about this issue. And I think that we really should urge for some urgent action to be taken to set up a proper whistleblowing mechanism, which we just don't have at the moment.
Thank you, Willie. And I presume when you mean former Constitutional Court judges, you also mean former judge presidents of the Competition Appeal Court. Could be part of that panel.
Indeed. I'm pretty happy with almost all retired judges, but I do think notionally that it may not be a bad thing for a retired Constitutional Court judge to be the head of such a body, just because of the stature that comes with it. I'd love Dennis to do it, of course.
Thank you, Willie.
It's been such an illuminating discussion for me. Two things on whistleblowers. One is, I think, picking up on something that Mr. Lamola said about the importance of, actually everyone has said, individual liability, and it's worth thinking about who should be liable. And it was raised that it should be the demand side also, the public officials. I think that when South Africa considers a whistleblowing regime, it's worth it to consider both having a regime designed for employees to report what's going on in the company. But I also think, picking up on something the Basel Institute out of Geneva is doing, it would be really helpful to have a different regime, sort of an ombudsman regime, where companies that are being extorted can come to an independent government ombudsman. I like the idea of a retired judge who's insulated politically, and say, I'm being extorted. I may or may not have to pay the bribe, either to avoid having, something terrible happening to my business or to get what I need, but I would like not to. And can you either intervene or whatever? And if you were to allow companies to report the public officials without fear of being punished if they do so, and have that group then go after the public officials, notice those cases could be fast, because the companies would have all the evidence on the public officials, could show that they were paying bribes. And this would go a very long way. On the other side, I do think you need to give rewards to whistleblowers, because in the US, once we had a whistleblowing system, thousands of them came in of highly variable quality. And the judges and enforcement won't have the resources to go through them. So you need to incentivize lawyers to do the investigation in advance, so that the judges know this case is good and this one isn't good, because we got more than our government officials could handle.
Thank you, Jennifer. Peter, let's get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I just would serve as a fact witness for a minute. At all the companies where I've served as an executive officer, we had very robust hotlines and whistleblowing protection. And just two observations. One is 95% of what comes in is junk. It's people settling scores and not understanding what's going on, but there's 5% which is quite useful. And I'd say to any business executive, most businesses are afraid of this. It's actually incredibly useful. It's like having a private audit staff, and should be embraced by business as an opportunity to get ahead of a problem before it ends up with law enforcement or elsewhere. So it works well, requires some capable people who can sift through the junk and deal with the people who are afraid, justifiably afraid that they will be protected. Usually they're afraid of being fired more than anything else. And if you can assure that that's not going to happen, a lot of problems are resolved. End of fact testimony.
Thank you, Peter. Judge Davis.
Just a couple of points before I just make a preliminary remark to John. I don't want to run on the banks, John, and I certainly don't suggest that when people are implicated in Zondo that they're immediately prosecuted. But I do think it should trigger off a serious investigation by virtue of corporate governance, just to see what, and a proper explanation, which is what I took you to be saying, and I think that's absolutely right. And then just finally to the Minister, I also think that whilst I understand perfectly that you can't have the National Prosecuting Authority, as it were, seen to be, inverted commas, corrupted by the private sector, I understand what he means, but I do think there are ways around that in order to harness the expertise of the society as a whole to basically assist the NPA in this regard. In relation to the whistleblowing regime, Michael, I support Willie's point entirely. It seems to me the present legislation is inadequate for a whole range of reasons. I have had to sit on a number of cases on the Labour Appeal Court dealing with the question of disclosures and dismissal pursuant to disclosures, and people saying, you know, the disclosure was simply an act of pique because someone was demoted, not promoted, etc., etc. There are a whole lot of weaknesses with the Act. We don't define harm. Even look at the Ghanaian Act, it's so far superior to ours, it's quite astonishing on that particular front. I think we should be thinking about reverse onus provisions because you put whistleblowers in an extremely difficult position in this regard. There is also the argument about should whistleblowers get legal assistance when they come forward, and that may well fit in with Willie's point, because if you had a group of judges, and I am using judges particularly because the one thing I disagree with Willie on, I don't like the idea of saying the Constitutional Court is the only legitimate institution in the country. As a retired judge, I'd like to hold to the view that the judiciary is a legitimate institution by and large. Of course, we've all judiciaries have got odd people in it, but by and large, our judiciary is an institution I'm proud of, so I want to keep to that. But I agree that the head of it should be a Constitutional Court judge, a senior judge, and perhaps we could have other judges there. And if we essentially crafted a mechanism with that in mind, one, I could foresee the possibility of legal assistance for whistleblowers. I could see the possibility of a system of whistleblowing applying in circumstances whereby many of the problems that have vexed the drafting at present would go away. And then I just want to make one final point. That brings me back to the first point. Whistleblowing is also a question of the culture of the society in which it's located. So I don't know this. John will probably know better than I, and I'm being cautious, bearing in mind that I was misinterpreted once. I don't want to be misinterpreted again. And it's this. I obviously interviewed Athol Williams, who's a very well-known whistleblower in South Africa, and his big complaint was that effectively the private sector turned his back on him and that he was unable to get a job in South Africa and there was no assistance from the private sector. I hasten to add, I have no evidence one way or the other whether that is true, but it's a well-published allegation. And so the question really arises, to what extent will the private sector, as it were, embrace the regime? Because without that, you're always going to have significant difficulties. And let me then make the final point, that within the context of South Africa, the point made quite rightly by the minister is, given the egregious levels of inequality in South Africa, with a Gini coefficient the worst anywhere in the world, we need to have legitimacy of our entire institutions, including the private sector. And I would hope that Athol Williams's allegations are incorrect, but if they are correct, then quite clearly something has to be done about that.
Thank you, Judge. I mean, John, why don't you respond to that? And then President Shorby, I know you've got your hand up as well.
Yeah, thanks. And I'm so sorry Judge Davis, that I have misinterpreted you.
Not at all.
2 points for me. I think it's good to have this discussion about a prospective whistleblowing protection regime. But people have lost their houses, people have lost their jobs, have been blackballed, have not had work for years. So my appeal would be twofold. As we design the new system, and a proper system, is to look back into the current sufferers. And I'm not going to name them, but 2 instances come to mind where a bank wrote off the debts of a home loan to one of the whistleblowers, and then another bank wouldn't do the same thing. But there's other sorts of help that whistleblowers require today, non-financial help, such as psychosocial support services. And clearly, I think the private sector should be able to look into this to provide some kind of relief, immediate relief to the current sufferers now. And obviously, the biggest step that you can take to restore their dignity is to give them jobs. So the system of blackballing them, I think, has to stop.
Thank you, John. Professor Shope.
Thank you, Mike. So I just wanted to make 2 comments, and Judge Davis touched on this. They're talking about the culture of society, but I wanted to say that when we talk about whistleblowing, I always like to take a step back and talk about what is the culture in the firm or in the public sector in terms of speak up and challenge. Because before a whistleblower goes public, they must have tried to resolve this issue internally. And in the work that I've done, there are 2 things that determine whether or not an organization will end up with an ethical scandal. It is the leadership, whether there's ethical leadership, and whether there's a culture of challenge and speak up in the organization. If these 2 things are present, then ethical failures are usually addressed before they can blow up into something else. And I think that's something that we don't talk about in the public sector in South Africa. We know that some political parties use positions as a reward. Even when people have been implicated in serious ethical issues, they are rewarded with positions in other organizations, and so we don't really focus on the character of the people that we have in the public sector in positions of leadership. It's one of the recommendations of Zondo, but I think it's a conversation that South Africa really needs to have, that the character of the people that we have, are we happy with that? And if we're not, what is the way forward in making sure that we don't, recycle people who are or have had a dodgy past, if I can say that. So that's what I wanted to talk about.
Thank you, Professor. Minister Lamola, I wanted to get your thoughts on this topic. Again, where does your department sit? What is the current thinking? And in light of what you've heard today, whether you have any remarks?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, we are looking into this matter, particularly after a number of whistleblowers have been affected. As you are aware, the current regime of witness protection only covers someone or even a whistleblower when he or she becomes a witness. And that is a very late stage of the investigation, and a decision to prosecute might have been taken. So the regime needs to cover the processes from when someone becomes a whistleblower at the level of the floor at work and so forth. And so that is what we are currently looking into, the Canadian system and also the current US system, to see how can we learn lessons from that and be able to implement the system in our country. You will also be aware that this is one of the major issues that has been raised from the Zondo Commission's report. And the bigger challenge that we are currently facing is the reality that while we are looking at legislation and all that, the whistleblowers, as John has said, their struggle is ongoing. What do we do now with the current situation, which we find ourselves in a difficult position because legislation that we have is the witness protection and does not extend to the whistleblower. What do we do as we speak now? So those are the challenges that we are currently grappling with, and we have been given a clear line of march from the president himself to work on this with agency, given the current difficult situation that the whistleblowers are finding themselves in. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. We only have a few minutes left. Professor Shorpe, I know I want you to give some thoughts on addressing the demand side of corruption. It was one of the key focus areas of the OECD recommendation. Could you try and run us through your key thoughts as quickly as possible, and we'll then leave some time open for any questions from the floor or from the virtual audience.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so I'll make this really quick. I think it was Jennifer that already mentioned that we don't have a symmetry when it comes to enforcing demand side and supply side bribery. So in countries where supply side bribery is obviously bribery done by the private sector, demand side is the public officials demanding the bribes. So we find that there isn't a symmetry in the sense that a firm might be undergoing enforcement in their country, but the public official, usually say in a country like South Africa isn't facing any form of consequences. So that's a problem. And I think that's what this recommendation was trying to address. There's been a lot of focus on supply side more than demand side in terms of enforcement. And that's for a number of reasons. It's because obviously we know that corruption cases are difficult. We've talked about that. Sometimes there isn't enough evidence in the host country, if you like, statutes of limitations, and sometimes immunities that public officials might have while they are in office, or political office holders might have while they're in office. So these are some of the challenges that demand side bribery has, or enforcing consequences against public officials, if I can say that. So we have a problem, and when we talk about enforcement, a lot of the foreign bribery enforcement relates to two types of transactions: public procurement as well as tax administration. And so that's where we see a lot of foreign bribery happening, a lot of the demand side bribery happening. So South Africa, we know we've criminalized foreign bribery, and we know, especially from Zondo now, we know that a lot of the procurement corruption is conducted, or at least the state capture is conducted by local firms as well as foreign firms. I don't think there's really a lot of difference in prevalence. The foreign firms who were able to, get their hands dirty seem to be very willing to do that. And I think we haven't really seen enforcement of foreign bribery because we haven't seen enforcement of domestic bribery. So our bribery, we don't really make a distinction. We don't look at Bain, for instance, or KPMG and say, these are foreign companies, like these are companies that were bribing, that were abusing the procurement system, as well as, the domestic companies as well. So what we have to do is to really enforce, I would just say really enforce, procurement corruption, whether it's done by foreign companies, whether it's done by local companies, the effects are the same. At least the effects on South Africa and South Africans are the same. And both domestic and foreign companies are gaming our system, and we need to address that. What many countries do, especially developing countries, in trying to deal with this, deal with demand side bribery, is to use the anti-money laundering framework, because sometimes it's easier to do that, to actually target people using those laws than using corruption laws, because of the burden of proof, the secrecy involved, etc., some of the things that I've talked about. One of the recommendations that the OECD proposes now is that we need to have greater international cooperation and better reporting channels. I mentioned the fact that we don't have a symmetry between supply side bribery and demand side bribery. But it still seems that these reporting channels, the existing channels, aren't working. So there does need to be sort of an international conversation on, what kind of reporting channels should countries be using. Many of the foreign bribery enforcement comes by way of media reports and not really by conversations between countries, criminal justice or prosecutors or investigators. So we need to think countries need to think about what do we want to do, how do we want to work together to actually get this information out there. And then the other thing that I think I've mentioned already is really the ethical standards and the character of people that we put in procurement, but across the civil service, political leadership. One of the Zondo Commission recommendations is to have a look at the professionalization of procurement. We've talked about that, but also the ethical standards of procurement officials, because I think that is one of the missing pieces, especially here in South Africa, and that's one of the things that we have to really consider. In terms of there's actually, for me, and I think someone else has already mentioned this, there's a lot of synergy between, I think the minister mentioned this actually, there's a lot of synergy between the Zondo Commission recommendations as well as the new OECD recommendations. So if the South African government can actually implement some of these, they will be, killing two birds with one stone. The final point that I want to make is in terms of including the private sector in policy formulation. That's one of the OECD recommendations. That's also a Zondo Commission recommendation. And Stellenbosch University is actually trying to drive the conversation on that through our new academy known as the Pavagat Stellenbosch Academy. So you can look out for information on that. So I just wanted to plug that. And also Western countries, I should say, can follow the lead of the US and make sure that their countries are not a safe haven for developing country kleptocrats and people who abuse our procurement process systems, who take bribes, who steal our resources, and so I think that's where I will stop in the interest of time. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Professor. I mean, the one other mechanism which hasn't been discussed today is, and it dovetails with quite a few of the topics, is the reliance on Section 34 of the Prevention of Combating Corrupt Activities Act, which obliges persons to report suspicions of wrongdoing to the authorities. And I'm not aware, and Billy, you can let me know if you perhaps aware of any investigation, any case that ever been brought under Section 34 on a failure to report. And I think that could be sort of another mechanism without, I mean, the law's there. It's a lot of companies already do report, but there seems to be a lot that goes unnoticed. Vili, I see both you and Judge Davis' hands up. Vili, you want to go ahead?
Hi, sorry, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I wanted to make just a couple of points. Now, I think the one issue is that there is not the issue of a proper whistleblower mechanism. I think that is vital. I think there were many people in the state who wanted to say something, but they really didn't trust the mechanisms that there are in the state to report. So, I think the idea of a proper mechanism headed by constitutional court judges, as I said, to deal with whistleblowers, for me, is a critically important issue. But I wanted to just raise one last issue just for everybody's attention. But I think one of the big challenges in state capture was that when we wrote the Constitution, we were somewhat starry-eyed. And the Constitution just says the president appoints every important person in law enforcement. No process is described. When we get a bad president, essentially becomes incredibly easy to capture the whole of law enforcement and to appoint bad people. So I think that can partly be dealt with the integrity testing process, but I do think that's something that we need to think about very seriously. I think with recent appointments, at least there's been some kind of process in the NPA to appoint people, but it's purely voluntary. There's no legal obligation to check people out properly and so on before they are appointed to very key and very important positions in law enforcement. Thank you.
Thank you, Vili. Judge Davis.
Yeah, it's very interesting that Willie says that because for those of you who didn't notice, today in the Daily Maverick, there was an article published by ex-Deputy Chief Justice Moseneke, who spoke about the imperial presidency and precisely the weakness that Willie's now spoken about, the unfettered powers of a president, which we all, and those of us who were involved in the drafting of the Constitution, of which I have to plead guilty, we all basically said, Mr. Mandela will never do this. And unfortunately, that's not the way you draft a constitution. So that's absolutely correct. The second point I wanted to make, which just touched right at the end, Michael, is we haven't spoken about it because, of course, it's a different report, but the mutual evaluation report of 2021 of October raises a whole lot of points that have just been touched upon, which is the 11 areas that we have to actually improve on in South Africa if we're not going to get blacklisted. And part of that problem is the institutions. So if you go back to the state capture, there is no question that there was a failure somewhere along the line. I don't know where it lay. It could have laid in all sorts of areas along the value chain, from the banks, who essentially were the bankers for people who secreted money out of the country. The banks probably would argue, and maybe with great justification, that they reported this to the Financial Intelligence Center and to the South African Reserve Bank, which failed, and which then reported to SARS, which also failed. But along that route, there's no question that this report of October 2021 says if we don't fix these issues up, South Africa can land up by being blacklisted if it doesn't address the 11 problems. And those are very, very serious in relation to money laundering, terrorist financing, and general levels of corruption.
Thank you, Judge. Well, I think on those important closing remarks, I think we have very limited time left. I'm first going to open to the floor. If anyone has any questions, you're welcome to raise your hand now. I see there is a question from one of the audience panel. There's a question.
Thanks very much. And thanks for the invitation, which I owe to Steph Torres here. My name is Stavros Nikolai, and I thought I better come to John Bludler's rescue, seeing that he said he's been ambushed this evening. Mine is more a comment rather than a question. And this is a critically important discussion that you've had this evening. In fact, Busa had the very same discussion with Minister Lamola about a month ago. Why is it so important, aside from all the obvious things, and you might have covered this because I'm a late arrival to the meeting, but there is probably no better way of restoring confidence in the economy than if foreign investors have confidence in the entire judicial system, the processes, and they also, like us, want to see action. Now, we're not, of course, we're not as business ambivalent to what is required to get there. But the international investor community will judge us by our actions. And that's why these conversations are critical, because they need to be turned into action. And my final comment is, seeing that we're in this sort of post-COVID, we'll hear what the president says in 20 minutes or so, period. What is very important is that we build on some of the public-private interfaces that's taken place during COVID. And the Business for South Africa example is a primary example of that. Many law firms were involved on a pro bono basis. I'm not suggesting you start earning a living on pro bono stuff, and Stephanie here will complain if we do that. But I think there is a good case to be made, and I know the minister touched on it, where we rally together as a society, and in doing so, put shoulder to the wheel, offer expertise, experience, skill, talent, whatever it is, to try and move this process forward in the country. That is the best way to restore investor confidence. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Stavros. I think those are the excellent comments and insight. And I mean, I think one of the key takeaways from this discussion is it just seems that there is an abundance of willingness to support government in its efforts to combat corruption. So, Minister, before I let you sort of give you any closing remarks you might have, I could just re-extend the invitation, certainly on behalf of the organizations in which we're involved, the International Bar Association, the OECD, and of course, as a firm, what we can do as Primario. I think that offer remains. And I'd very much like to hear if you have any Any closing remarks before we have to wrap up the session?
No, thank you very much. I think for us, we will consider the comments made in this platform as we look into the recommendations of the Zondo Commission. As I've said, this platform has come at a timely moment because we are deep at work looking at those recommendations. So we will go through them in parallel with these recommendations of the OECD. And I do think that there are valuable points and inputs that we are taking home from this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister, and thank you very much again for your willingness to participate in this panel. Thank you to all our panelists, the international guys, Peter, Jennifer, Drago, thank you very much for your efforts in not only contributing to today's session, but in your continued efforts with the rollout of promoting the OECD recommendations. Judge Davis and Vili, household names, and great to have you participate as well. John, thank you very much for your participation, and Professor Shorpe, always good to have you on board as well. So thank you to all our attendees, our panelists. I don't think that's going to be where I don't think we're going to end the discussion throughout the year, but we are going to end it here tonight. And for those who aren't here in person, unfortunately, you won't be able to enjoy the drinks and canapes we have on the balcony. But that's a penalty you pay for doing this in the comfort of your living room. All right. Thank you, everyone. And with that, we'll close the session. Thank you very much.